So we talked about classification and classification in the modern sense of defining evolutionary groups or monophyletic groups. And that's had a major impact on the names that we call plant species and other species. And so this is a little bit deeper dive into the topic of naming in plants. There's the concept of naming categories and also naming species, which are in themselves a little bit of a category. So a species is a name for a group of plants that all share similar features. And as we defined it as a species, of course, those would be able to produce offspring together. So plant species have defined names. And these are some examples. So your book, your Wisconsin Flora, has these kinds of names in there. You might have some exposure to scientific names. Maybe you're familiar with a few, maybe you use them regularly, maybe you never decided to get familiar with them. At any rate, they're kind of the anchor for the more scientific concept of a species. So if you're familiar with animals, you can get away with common names in some of the larger animals. There aren't too many confusing animal mixtures, so if you're describing the vertebrate mammals of North America, the common names are pretty well defined. If you get into these groups that have a lot more species like plants and insects, you really have to follow these more specific names because you kind of run out of common names. Plants, I'll be honest, don't always have exciting common names. And so if you want really the most definitive name, you're going to want to go to these scientific names. So here's some examples. We have two words in italics. Those are what's most commonly treated as the scientific name. And then after the names, I want to point this out because this is something you might run into. So they're in your guidebooks where you're identifying species. They're going to be on some of the resources that we use in this class. They're the names of people. So following the 1-2 names here, there's a person's name, often abbreviated, and these are defined abbreviations. So Engelm is an abbreviation for Engelmann, and so on. Some of these are entire names if they are particularly famous or rather short names. So Gray, there's more than one Gray, but the one that's abbreviated just as Gray, that's a specific person, and so on. So a lot of really adhering to the rules for keeping one name being specific. So there's one specific scientific name, and there's one specific abbreviation for the person or people who, as we'll see, named those species. So I'm going to break this apart into its components. As I mentioned, the part in italics is 2 words, and those 2 words are actually the genus name as part of this 2-word species name. So some people like to remind you that the name for a species is actually these 2 words. Another way to say that is it's a binomial. So binomial means 2 names. So those 2 names together are in fact the species name in the most specific sense. But their species names are made up of genus name and what's known as the specific epithet. And in plants in particular, again, these names, there's lots of different plant names, and the specific epithet is often not very informative. So it's hardly unique. They often describe something rather simple about how this species is different from similar species in the same genus. So Hypericum majus, this means bigger. Scutellaria ovata, this is ovate, probably describing the leaves. Gallium brevipes, brevipes is probably a short pedicel or something like that. And so it's, kind of just this little characteristic about it is not telling you about that species exactly. It's more like a defying adjective that separates it from other ones that it might be confused with. So the genus name is part of that. The genus name is a category itself. So there's a category for the genus Cuscuta, the genus Hypericum. And then within those genera are more than one or sometimes just one species. And these names, as I said before, are regulated. They're strict. There should be only one name for a species. And if this is correct, the correct name for that species, that would be it. Scutellaria ovata is the species name. Now, over here on the right, these names for people, sometimes you get one in parentheses. Sometimes you don't get one in parentheses. if there's a name in parentheses, that just means that the name, the epithet was actually co-opted from a previous name. So a lot of times this happens if a species is recategorized from one genus into another. A lot of times it takes with it the specific epithet. So one of the rules is basically the first person who assigned an epithet to a species, that epithet follows it into whatever genus it goes into. So that allows the person who named it, basically, we often think of discovering it. So this person who first wrote it down for the English or Latin speaking world, they get credit for it. And then somebody later often recategorizes it, they get a little credit too. So it's originally these names were a way to sort of trace back to the original descriptions. We still use them in that way, but they're often used as just kind of an attachment to the name. Like we all know what name we're talking about, and so you would just keep those on there as a little tag for making sure we know specifically which name you're talking about. So you're going to run into these. Maybe they'll make sense for you. Maybe you won't. Maybe you won't enjoy thinking about the names attached to the scientific names, but they're going to be there. And if you want to get into more specific practice using scientific names, it's good to know what they are and maybe get familiar with using them. So we call them taxonomic authorities. So it's sort of author, but a different variation on that. So authority, the person who, as I said, basically named the species in the first place or assigned it to a new category. All right. So there are some different opinions about how a person should pronounce a scientific name. There are some very strong opinions. So some people feel very strongly that you've got to pronounce certain letters certain ways, certain emphasis on certain syllables. So illustration here, tomato, tomato, right? This is a little bit closer to my take on scientific naming, is that these are names that are standardized across the world. So not just people who speak English, people in any part of the world, people in China are using these names for their plant species. And so they might not pronounce them anywhere close to how you pronounce them. And that's okay. To be honest, these names they're really in place so that we can use them in written language. More important than that, the next more important thing is that if you're discussing something like talking with someone about a plant species, that you both know what you're talking about. So I won't enforce pronunciation on here, but I did make a little video kind of pointing out a little bit of the basics of how these names are put together and a little bit of the kind of the prevailing thought about how to pronounce scientific names. I'll provide the video there on the Canvas page. I also have a link on here. I won't go to it now, but there's a link to this summary about pronouncing plant names and basically summarizes what I've said there, that we can pretend that there's agreement across the world. There's not even agreement from one end of our country to the other. So it's kind of a fool's errand, I think, to try to get everyone to say exactly the same scientific names. That's my take. Other people might have different takes on it. You can talk to those people. Some of the scientific names are interesting for sort of the history of what they mean. So I gave you a little bit of a taste. I was mentioning those scientific name epithets as far as what they mean. A lot of those come from Latin or Greek. The earlier names, that was very common. Sometimes you have species that are named after people or places. And sometimes they're useful. Sometimes you can look at that scientific name and it reminds you about a feature you need to observe in that species to identify it. Sometimes that's helpful. Sometimes they're just kind of silly. This one was from a blog that I kind of enjoy. There's a link to it here. And it was highlighting this scientific name. The genus is called Onoportum, and it literally translates to donkey fart. So this is the donkey fart plant. And I believe it is purported to do something. I forget actually whether it gives donkeys the farts or maybe cures it, or maybe donkeys just love eating this plant. But it's one of these spiky thistle type of plants, Onoportum. So genus name anyway is donkey fart. Okay, so if you encounter a species, it's going to have these binomials for its species name. binomial nomenclature. As we saw before, nomenclature is the practice of assigning names to species. And so one that you might have heard about here, Cannabis sativa, is on here on the description. It's 2 words, as we saw before, made up of the genus name and the specific epithet. So the species name is the 2-word combination. Genus name is capitalized. So as a category, the genus is capitalized. The epithet is not capitalized, and I have this little bit here, although the tradition, we're looking at 300 years of tradition with naming plants, even in the Linnaean tradition. And before that, people had names for these, that the practice of capitalizing the genus and not capitalizing the specific epithet, that wasn't always practiced universally. If the specific epithet is named for a person or a place, in older literature, you'll often see that capitalized. So something that is called canadensis means it's from Canada, and Canada is a proper noun, so sometimes that gets capitalized. The modern usage for that is not to capitalize those, and I think you'll see that pretty commonly. Is just not any capitalization on the second word of the binomial. So we saw this difference between species name and specific epithet. Species name is both words, the specific epithet is the second word. If you use a genus name, say you're writing a paper about a genus of plants, and you mention a name, the next time you mention that, you can abbreviate the genus. So if you're writing a paper and you say Cannabis sativa, I'm going to underline this. So I'm going to do this. You can maybe just use this as shorthand for, if I was typing, I would make it in italics. So my reminder to everybody that this is a scientific name. I don't know if you'd mix it up with anything else, but you could write about it is a ... If you're writing in a paragraph, you write a few extra sentences. The next time you mention it, used C sativa. So in that sense, if you're continuing to describe plants in the same genus, basically if you're writing this out and people know what genus you're talking about, if you have a publication where you're only talking about one genus, or there's only one genus with that same starting letter, you can abbreviate it this way. Saves time. You'll probably see this in reading, but actually in speaking about these words, we don't ever just call it C. So sometimes this is a little bit different from animals again. Sometimes in animals, it's the epithet carries a lot more weight. It's unique and distinctive. Sativa is basically an edible description of an edible plant. So it's not like specific to this plant at all. And C sativa, there could be lots of C sativas out there. So just in common usage, get used to saying, if you're going to say a scientific name, go in all the way and pronounce out the whole genus name. So Cannabis sativa, even if you write it this way, you can not really get away with using that C. So it's Cannabis sativa every time. All right, so can be abbreviated when people know absolutely what you're talking about. Genus and species names are both italicized or underlined. I say underlined basically if you're doing it in handwriting. It's hard to write in italics. And the tradition is now not to italicize anything above the level of genus. So if we see a family, family that contains cannabis is Cannabaceae. And you'll see that these are not italicized, although sometimes it's really hard to get a whole world of people to agree on this, but I would say don't italicize these, and mostly you won't see them italicized. Okay, so we have a lot of rules about how to name species, and because there are rules, there has to be kind of a governing body and a documentation for how to enforce these rules. The most basic principle in nomenclature, in deciding what the right name is that the first person to name it gets to establish their name. So this gives a lot of credit to people who so-called discover species. If you discover a species, that means that you determine that it is its own thing, and it's different from, often different from something that looks like it. So describing a species is usually a matter of making a careful determination of that something is different from its close relatives. So if you did that work, you didn't just stumble upon it somewhere. If you did that work, you deserve some credit. Now, there's a little bit of a caveat to that, is that the oldest name at the rank has to be used. So you might, as I mentioned, you might recategorize a species and have it fall into a new genus. The priority still applies to that epithet. So the oldest epithet for a species, no matter what genus it falls into, the oldest epithet is the one with priority. And we go over these. There's people who spend their whole career kind of dealing with the ins and outs of nomenclature. We're just going to gloss over this. It's kind of fascinating. It really is built on the principle of fairness, giving people a chance to be first and to be respected for doing something first, even if something flashier comes along later. So if you wanted to, you could track down this link here. This is basically a thorough explanation of the rules. It's known as the International Code of Nomenclature, as it says here. And it's the nomenclature code that applies to algae, fungi, and plants. Algae, fungi, and plants. It means that it doesn't apply to bacteria, it doesn't apply to animals. So this is the kind of the limit of this system of nomenclature. The animals and plants people, they don't typically compare notes on nomenclature. So if you know any rules about naming animals, they might not apply here. Although some of the basic principles of priority and fairness apply. So one example here, this is a single species that has two names. Sometimes this happens if two different people discover a plant around the same time, describe it at the same time. Back in 1759, maybe this was not widely published, although that was Carl Linnaeus. Maybe there was some confusion about whether these were in fact different species. At any rate, two names exist. They're both in the genus Magnolia, and the earlier name done by L. Carl Linnaeus, 1759, this one would be used, and M. Magnolia lacanosa from 1840, that would be treated as a synonym. All right, so if you get a new species, as I mentioned, this is a pretty serious piece of work to determine that something is new as a new species. It involves describing it, so calling attention to what makes it different from the species that are already known. And lots of things we're going to explore as we go. One important thing at the beginning here, so we have a name, these people with their specific author designations. They described a species, which was a new species at the time, known as Microlicia stenodonoides. And in here it has kind of priority, very important in the description is this mention of type. So a type is a physical specimen. We'll get a chance to collect some specimens in this class. A physical specimen that is meant to be a representation of that species. And the type is really important because it is contains within it a whole bunch of information about the plant itself, sometimes more even than you could write about. So there might be features on that plant that people are not observing at the first time when they discover the species that can be consulted later. So it's a physical plant specimen, and it has a very specific collection location, latitude, longitude, and coordinates. And then this part in italics here, this is a reference to the actual collection. So collected by these people on this date, February 4th, 2016. And then here, holotype and isotypes, they're copies of the same collection. So they collected bits of the same plant and put them in a few different places. UFG and HUFU, these are herbaria, places where people keep these dried specimens. So we'll get into the type specimen a little bit more as we go. As this species was determined to be a new species, these are the characteristics in this zone that are determined to be different, distinctive for it. So often describing a new species involves pointing out how it's similar to a known species and then how it's different from the known species. So um, description. I don't know if I have the diagnosis part in here. Sometimes there's a brief part that kind of emphasizes exactly why it's different. Etymology, this is the origin of the name. So it talks about Stenodonoides, referring to the genus Stenodon. And then we have here relationships. Here we have a bunch of comparisons to other known species. And then the illustration, you often find these illustrations, they're lovely contributions to science, but they're a lot of work. So often you see them, they're not strictly required as you're describing a new species, but certainly can remove some ambiguity if you describe and illustrate all the parts you're talking about. So making a new species is great, but new species do not always stay in the genus where they were described. And sometimes it's a different process to take an existing species and put it into a new category. So this one I was actually, this was a species I had the fortune of reassigning. We did a phylogenetic study. So we saw phylogenies in the last topic. We were talking about evolution. And it turns out that this genus called Nymphoides, this is a genus of aquatic plants with floating leaves. Turns out that that group, if we trace it back to its common ancestor back here, the descendants of that common ancestor include Nymphoides species, but also included this species called Valarsia cambodiana, which doesn't have floating leaves. So it has a very different growth form than the Nymphoides species, but we have to interpret it based on the evolutionary evidence as a plant that had an ancestor with floating leaves that then switched to this emergent wetland habitat or habit. So growth form with these upright leaves and kind of a angled off to the side, kind of decumbent inflorescence, but it has lots of similarities to Nymphoides. So based on DNA evidence, based on morphology, it really belongs within this other genus Nymphoides. And so that was the thrust of this paper, was explaining that and doing the illustration. It was a fun thing to be part of. And so it was transfer to Nymphoides out of the genus Valarsia. So a new name had to be created in the genus Nymphoides. This species is now called Nymphoides cambodiana. And so a little bit more about these transfers here. So the transfer of Nymphoides cambodiana from Valarsia was a transfer. Here's an example of a transfer. This is a name established in 1906, Cyperus filiculmus variety Massilentus. We didn't talk about variety yet. This is a category under the level of species. So Cyperus filiculmus is the species and variety is a subdivision within the species. So variety Massilentus, named by this person called Fernald in 1906. So a little bit of a kind of a walkthrough of this process. This person says, okay, I have a new plant, not a new species in this case, but he says this is a new variety that deserves a name. Names are useful for understanding what something is and diversity. And someone later came along and said that entity that Fernald described as a variety actually should be its own species. So this is kind of a taxonomic opinion by Professor Bicknell here in 1908, who took the existing category and elevated it to a different level. And so by doing so, it needed a species name all for itself. So it needed a unique species name. And he did the favor of bringing that variety name, Massilentus, into the level of species. So now Cyperus massilentus is a variety that's now been assigned as a proper species. Fernald gets credit for naming the thing called Massilentus, and Bicknell gets credit for putting it into the genus Cyperus. So here's a little explanation for why we have these two kinds of names there. Okay, so I mentioned types. This is an example of a type specimen. This is the name and the specimen that goes with it. So the species is called Liperophyllum gunnii. Hook F, that little F there means the son of, so last name is Hooker. This is the child of Joseph Dalton Hooker. Described this species, and in the description, of that species identified this collection as the one that was going to be the reference point. So this person observed the plant in the flesh, was able to describe what was going on with the plant while it was alive, maybe did some dissections. There's a lovely set of illustrations down here done from live plants. So flower from the side, dissected flower showing the petals and the stamens attached to the petals, cross sections, longitudinal sections of the ovary. So that's kind of an extra bonus you don't often get on a type specimen, but very clearly illustrating what this plant looked like before it was dried and flattened. So this specimen here, for better or for worse, this is the anchor for the name Lipperophyllum gunnii. What that means is whatever that name refers to, it has to refer to this species. So this plant that's on the sheet here has to be Lipperophyllum gunnii because that's anchored to the name. It could be that something is wrong about the description or something is wrong about the categorization, but because of the association with the name and the specimen, the name has to follow this specimen. So usually type specimens are good examples. Sometimes they're fragments or sometimes we've lost them, but ideally they're a good example of the species. And there'd be other collections that are the same species, but only one that is the type specimen. So as I say here, it's if you're ever uncertain as to what should be called Lipperophyllum gunnii, everything else that's called Lipperophyllum gunnii should be the same species as this one. So there's a type for a species. There's also what's known as a type species for a genus. So the genus category of Lipperophyllum has not just a type specimen, but it actually has a type species. So it's sort of the category below it. So the genus Lipperophyllum, turns out at the time it was described, there was only one species in the genus, so that's kind of easy. The genus Lipperophyllum has to be whatever genus contains this species, Lipperophyllum gunnii. And you can work your way up the classification hierarchy. There's a type genus for a family. There's a type family for an order, and so on. So the names are anchored. So it's kind of a set of anchors and a set of principles of priority. And altogether, we have a rather impartial, mostly fair system for assigning the right name for the right category. Now, I mentioned before that sometimes species get extra names. So if different people in different parts of the world are studying the same species, maybe they think they're different. Maybe they just don't know about the work of somebody else. But oftentimes someone will come around later and say, yeah, all those names that are out there, those actually refer to the same species. And sometimes it can get rather extensive. Like in this example, this is a species called Hydrilla verticillata. There's only one species in the whole world in the genus Hydrilla. And so it contains a lot of other previous concepts of what the species was. Not only that, but lots of different assignments to different genera. So it's kind of a hallmark to maybe failed classification attempts. So at one point it was assigned to this genus Elodea. This is still an existing genus. Some of these genera, as far as I know, they were only assigned for this species, so they don't exist referring to anything that we consider a species on its own right now. So Epigenanthus, Hydora, Hydrilla, obviously lots of species contained within Hydrilla, Hydrospondylus, Serpicula, Eudora, Vallisneria. So it's had a lot of attention over the years, but ultimately those names all refer to the same species, and the oldest species name needs to be Hydrilla verticillata, at least the epithet here, Hydrilla verticillata, originally established by LF. This is the son of Linnaeus, and sometimes you can actually trace for the origin of that, and it's down here, Serpicula verticillata. This was the original description, the original species name by Linnaeus, child Linnaeus, grown man child Linnaeus. And then actually this person, Royal, assigned it to the genus Hydrilla, and that ends up being the correct combination of how to describe it. So as I have on here, the correct name, and what we consider to be correct, is a combination of the oldest name at the category and somebody's taxonomic decisions about what category it should belong to. So sort of two in one. Both of those work together to establish what the correct name is. Now, sometimes, even in this era, we still have some disagreement in what should be the correct name. So, and we're working towards it, I would say, but we still have lots of scientists in lots of parts of the world. One notable split is between the English-speaking world of North America and the English-speaking world of the United Kingdom. There's a lot of scientists in both areas, and they have their own plants that they're working with. And sometimes there's some disagreement, or sometimes it's just disagreement in, I don't know, random places around the world. So we're kind of working toward a system where we mostly agree on the right names, and mostly we do agree on the right names. I don't want to give you the impression there's a lot of disagreement here. But here are a couple of sources. This one here, ITIS, is the Integrated Taxonomic Information Service, and that's run by the US government, so that's a .gov address, and that'll be specific or at least more reliable for North American species. And then Plants of the World Online, this is relatively newer, and I'm quite fond of it now, but not every time it agrees with what I would say is the current name for a species. But like I said, we're getting there. So here's an example. I think this is kind of interesting. If you look at Elodia densa, this is a species, it's pictured at the center, it's an underwater plant. And according to ITIS, if you look in here, it says accepted name, Egeria densa. And then basically this name, Elodia densa, it says not accepted. So it would direct you to this other name, Egeria densa, whereas the Plants of the World Online says Elodia densa, and the first part here, the description said this species is accepted, and it lists as a synonym Egeria densa. So disagreement here on two internet resources. I'd say we're not too far away from scientists maybe just deciding to agree on one name service, kind of a database that serves names to everybody. We'll probably get there pretty soon. So for your purposes, most of the time the current name would be agreed upon. A lot of times your book will have an older name, or you might be talking with people who remember an older plant name. So it's kind of an ongoing source of, you've got to be able to compare some of the old names to some of the newer names to be able to have a coherent dialogue. All right, so if you don't want to take somebody else's word for it, you could try to investigate some of these things on your own. So should we call this plant that we just saw Egeria densa or Elodia densa? Well, phylogenetically, you could do both. So, or I guess you could do either. So Elodia is a genus. These are two species of Elodia. Egeria is a Egeria is a genus. These are two species of Egeria. They are sister genera, and based on this phylogeny, which might not be the agreed upon phylogeny or the most current phylogeny, but based on this, Elodia is monophyletic and Egeria is monophyletic. The big reason, I think there's some uncertainty about how monophyletic Egeria is, and so that's where this decision came up to expand the concept of Elodia, and now it contains everything in this group. And so these two species down here got put into Elodia. So Elodia densa, Elodia nias. I'd say you could sometimes weigh in for yourself on these things. If you have a synonym, if you got the same plant with different names, sometimes that happens in what's known as heterotypic synonyms. So we talked about type specimens, and I think it's maybe helpful to think about these terms. They're heavy, there may be unfamiliar words to you, but I think that's probably the cleanest way to refer to them. So heterotypic synonyms are two names that have different types. So shown right here, this is a plant on the left, Valarsia cambodiana, we talked about earlier, and on the right is Valarsia rhomboidalis. And this is the type specimen of Valarsia rhomboidalis. This is the type specimen of Valarsia cambodiana. And maybe even to your eyes, you could see these are very similar plants. So later it turns out that these are, there's no way to tell them apart. There's no real reason to tell them apart. They should be considered the same species. They were described as growing in the same area with the same format, same morphology and all this. They're not actually different, even though they have different names. And that's how we treat them these days. So they had to get put into synonymy, and because they have different names, these names are both in Valarsia, only one of them can be used as the correct name. So this is where the rule of priority comes in. So Valarsia cambodiana, described by Hance in 1877, that one got priority, and this name Valarsia rhomboidalis, this one has been relegated to the synonymy bin. Okay, so you can have this situation of heterotypic synonyms. You can also have a situation of homotypic synonyms. And this is what happens if you reassign a name into a new category. So here we've got two synonyms, the Valarsia name for Valarsia cambodiana and the Nymphoides name, Nymphoides cambodiana. Those are homotypic. So when Tippery here went and reassigned Valarsia cambodiana to the genus Nymphoides, there wasn't any new type required. The type existed. The type was describing a species. Even though it changed names, it's still the same species concept. And kind of an important difference from what we saw before, if you've got heterotypic synonyms, the older name gets used. If you've got homotypic synonyms, then you end up with a newer name that often is the newer name that's preferred. So by putting this into the genus Nymphoides, this reflects the current understanding of its phylogenetic position, its morphological similarities. And it's actually a name described in 2009 that is generally accepted as the current name here. So it's still giving credit to Hance from 1877, but it was actually a name established in 2009. And there's a little symbol on here. You never really run into it, but just in case you do, it's this 3-line equals sign, means that those names are identical. So they have the same type. They're referring to the same species. They're intimately connected. And if that ever got assigned into a third genus, that could be possible. And that would also be one of these homotypic synonyms. Okay, so moving up in the categories, I mentioned the types at the different levels. The different levels of classification have some standardization for their formats as well. We talked about the genus name being capitalized, being italicized, being part of the species binomial. And then above the level of genus, you get families. And families are going to be a big emphasis for plants in this class. So that's one way we're going to learn about our plants. You might not learn all the species in a family, but if you learn about how to identify the family, you make a big stride forward in being able to identify a plant. The official suffix for a family, we're going to see lots of these. It's an official suffix that tells you it's a family. So it's a capitalized word and it ends in ACEAE. So Boraginaceae, Fabaceae. These names are based on the name for a genus that's contained within the family. So Boraginaceae has the type genus of Borago, B-O-R-A-G-O, and Fabaceae has the type genus of Faba. So Faba, Fabaceae. And then moving up, orders have, I don't have an example in here. Maybe I'll draw one for us. Orders have an official ending of ALES. Order, ACEAE was family. And so you could take an example, Borago genus becomes the type genus of Boraginaceae. And if that is the if that's the type family for the order, then you could have an order called Boraginales. And I guess I should point out that these are not going to be the only members. Boraginales doesn't have to contain only Boraginaceae. There's also Hydrophyllaceae that just happens to belong to an order that doesn't have its name. So Hydrophyllaceae, Boraginaceae, Cordiaceae, these are all in the same order. And then similarly, the Boraginaceae family contains Borago, contains Lithospermum. So depending on the size of these groups, it's kind of a special member of the group that gets to have its name be part of the family category. So lots of genera in Boraginaceae, only Borago is the basis for the family name. And give you some examples there. Hopefully that all makes sense for you.